The cabin rocked gently as the evening swells nudged the hull. I was Corina, bending over the final documentation of a newly discovered wreck site, the dim lamplight reflecting off brass compasses and oil-stained charts. My hands shook slightly, but not from fear. This was the culmination of months of careful excavation, careful study, careful proof that I understood the sea and its secrets better than anyone aboard this vessel. And yet, in that fragile sanctuary, betrayal arrived in the shape of my sister. Anya, my own blood, stumbled into the cabin, eyes wide and tear-streaked, her hands trembling as if they had been forced to do things she now wished she could undo. "I can't do it, Corina," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Silas, he made me switch the ballast logs. He said, once you're gone, the insurance pays out. We can split the treasure map. He promised me wealth." I felt my chest constrict. Hot tea, freshly poured from the thermos Silas had insisted I drink, sloshed slightly in my hand, suddenly tasting metallic and bitter. My pulse throbbed in a rhythm that matched the slow, deliberate sway of the ship, and in that moment, the paralyzing weight of disbelief settled over me. Silas entered then, smooth as always, wearing the calm, calculated mask I had once trusted. His gaze swept over Anya, then me, as though we were objects to be assessed, plotted, and discarded. "Anya, you ruined the surprise," he said, voice soft, too soft. "Your expertise, Corina, proved the site too unstable for recovery. Your death is the final insurance requirement. Anya gets a consolation prize." I froze. My vision narrowed to a tunnel of cold comprehension. The sister I had guided, nurtured, and protected had been co-opted. The man I had loved, built my professional world with, and believed in had sold my life like a cheap trinket. The warm cup in my hands felt like lead. My breath caught. My mind screamed, but my body betrayed me first. I fell backward, and darkness swept me into its tidal pull. I thought of the wreck, the charts, the meticulous layers of research I had spent months securing. I thought of the sea, which had always been my confessor and my sanctuary. And I thought of them, Silas and Anya, greed twisting them into strangers I once loved. That was how it ended, cold, quiet, and suffocating. I had died knowing their hands had drawn my fate. Their ambition had written the ledger of my final hours. And yet, when I awoke, the smell of old maps and salt water would fill my lungs. I was 21 again, seated in the vast, quiet marine library my university maintained, pages of nautical charts fanned across the table. The date blinked at me in harsh fluorescent light, July 15th, 2013. I blinked, unsteady, as realization took root. This was before the wreck, before Silas, before Anya's treachery. I had been given a second tide, a second chance to correct the course. My heart raced with the same determination I had always carried, now sharpened by the memory of betrayal. And then I thought of Magnus, the old ship captain and family friend, whose weathered hands and unwavering principles had always reminded me of the truth beneath the surface. Silas had alienated him years ago, dismissing Magnus' integrity as old-fashioned. But now, in this reborn timeline, Magnus was the one I needed, the guardian of everything I could no longer let Silas corrupt. I found him in the shipyard, leaning over a rusted winch, his hands steady, his eyes reflective pools of knowledge. I did not need to explain the past in detail. I only needed to convey the urgency of the future. "Silas's salvage license, it relies on falsified data," I said softly. "Anya will help him conceal the flaws. You must intervene, stop this before it begins." Magnus' eyes sharpened, the ocean in him rising at the thought of deceit tainting his world. "You speak with absolute certainty. Why bring this to me?" "Because you respect the sea," I said. "And Silas and Anya, they corrupt everything they touch." He nodded, slow and deliberate, a man whose moral compass never wavered. In that nod, I felt a flicker of hope, a harbor in the storm, a promise that together, we could rewrite the course that had almost drowned me. For the first time in what felt like years, I felt the steadying presence of someone I could trust completely. And as we stood there in the sun-dappled shipyard, the scent of salt and oil surrounding us, I realized this second chance would not just be about reclaiming what Silas had tried to steal. It would be about discovering something deeper, something stronger, anchored in integrity, loyalty, and perhaps, in time, love. The morning fog lingered over the docks like a whispered secret. I stood at the edge of the pier, the boards damp beneath my boots, the air carrying the tang of salt and oil. Every creak of a rope, every soft splash against the hull seemed louder than it had any right to be. My mind replayed the events that had brought me here: Silas's betrayal, Anya's tears, the taste of the warm tea that had almost killed me. I could still feel the phantom weight of that glass in my hand, the sharp sense of helplessness that had almost drowned me before I woke again. Magnus appeared at my side as quietly as the morning tide. His presence was steady, grounding, like the solid keel of a ship beneath stormy seas. He glanced at the charts I held, his eyes narrowing slightly at the meticulous notes I had made. "You've thought this through," he said, his voice low and calm. "I have to," I replied, though my throat was tight. "I won't let them exploit the salvage licenses again. Not Silas. Not Anya. Not anyone." He studied me, as though weighing the fire in my eyes against the tides we had yet to navigate. Then, slowly, he offered a small nod, a subtle affirmation that felt heavier than any promise. "Then we begin," he said. Walking alongside him, I noticed the way his hands moved, always deliberate, never rushed, like the captain of a vessel who knows the sea as a friend and a foe. There was an intimacy in that ease of movement, a quiet authority that seemed to pull me closer without a word. As we stepped onto the ship Magnus had spent decades commanding, I realized how much I had missed this. Someone who operated by principle, who valued integrity over ambition, who made me feel safe even in the face of danger. We spent the day examining old logs, wandering the decks, and tracing the steps that Silas had once manipulated. I explained the critical flaws, the falsified ballast reports, the subtle oversights Anya had been coerced into. Magnus listened without interruption, occasionally resting a hand lightly on my arm to steady me as I leaned over a chart, pointing out the details that only someone who had lived at sea would immediately understand. The contact was brief, almost casual, a hand brushing mine while passing a pencil, a gentle nudge to shift my weight off a slippery deckboard, but each touch sent a ripple through me. My pulse quickened not from fear, but from something unfamiliar, something tender and urgent. I found myself watching him more closely, noticing the way the sunlight caught the silver in his hair, the way his eyes softened when he smiled at the tiniest observation, the way his voice resonated with a calm that seemed to belong entirely to me. By mid-afternoon, the tension of the past weeks had begun to ebb. I felt a rare sense of clarity. We were a team, bound not just by purpose, but by an unspoken trust. Magnus caught me staring at a particularly intricate diagram and leaned closer, brushing against my shoulder. His warmth was tangible, grounding me in a way that Silas never had. "You're relentless," he said quietly, almost teasing. "I admire that." I laughed softly, the sound more intimate than I had expected, and for a fleeting moment, I caught the faintest spark in his eyes, something unspoken but undeniably real. The air between us seemed to hum, a quiet charge that made the briny wind feel warmer. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance, but the line between professional caution and something more was razor-thin. As evening approached, we paused on the deck, looking out over the gentle waves reflecting the dying sun. Magnus leaned closer, his shoulder brushing mine, and I felt my breath catch at the nearness, the understated weight of his presence. The world had shrunk to the two of us, and the rhythm of the sea. "You've changed the course before it even began," he murmured, almost to himself, but I heard every word. I turned to him, heart hammering, and for the first time let my gaze linger on the man who had become my anchor. He met my eyes with a quiet intensity that left no room for doubt. Slowly, carefully, he leaned in, brushing his lips against mine in a deliberate, steady kiss. It was protective, affirming, and charged with the kind of quiet power that made me feel alive, unshakable, and entirely in his hands. Pulling back slightly, he rested his forehead against mine. "We'll navigate this together," he said, soft but certain. And I knew, in the depths of that evening light, that for the first time since betrayal had struck, I was finally anchored. The dawn was pale, almost hesitant, as it spilled over the harbor, brushing the decks with soft gold light. I walked alongside Magnus, the morning mist clinging to my hair and jacket. Every creak of the ship beneath our feet was a reminder of the fragile balance between trust and betrayal, between my past and the life I was beginning to reclaim. The memory of Silas's cold smile, Anya's tearful betrayal, still lingered at the edges of my mind, but with Magnus beside me, it felt smaller, contained, manageable. We moved from the main deck to the bow, where the ropes and pulleys formed a labyrinth I had once navigated without care. Today, however, every knot and crank carried weight, the weight of foresight, of the responsibility to thwart Silas's schemes. Magnus paused to adjust a taut line, his fingers skilled and sure, and I found myself watching the play of light on his hands, on his steady shoulders, on the way he carried himself with a confidence that made the wind itself seem calm. "You've learned fast," he said, a trace of amusement in his tone. I thought I'd have to explain every little thing. I turned, meeting his gaze, and caught the faint curve of a smile that made my pulse skip. "I've always had a good teacher," I replied, letting the words linger, charged with a playful undertone. He arched an eyebrow, eyes glinting with something between mischief and approval. We spent hours tracing the steps Silas had taken to manipulate his salvage operations. I showed Magnus the inconsistencies in the ballast logs, the subtle alterations in the schematics, the places where Anya's hand had trembled under pressure. Every revelation brought a nod of understanding, a brief, approving glance, or the occasional brush of his hand against mine as he passed papers or steadied me on a slick deck. The touches were innocent, but deliberate, carrying an intimacy that pulled at my chest like the undertow of a deep current. At one point, he stepped closer, his presence a shield against the cold, salt air. "You're meticulous," he said, voice low, almost private. "It's admirable and a little terrifying." I laughed softly, cheeks warming, heart hammering. "Terrifying?" I echoed, letting my eyes linger on his for a fraction too long. "You make me want to be better," he admitted, his gaze steady, unapologetic. The moment hung between us, thick as the fog rolling over the harbor, and I realized the danger of my racing thoughts, wanting more than professional collaboration, wanting the closeness that had been forbidden for so long. We paused at the ship's railing, looking out over the quiet waves. The harbor was waking slowly, gulls skimming the surface, the smell of salt and tar filling my lungs. Magnus reached out, resting a hand lightly on my lower back as he leaned over the railing. His touch was casual, protective, yet I felt the spark, the deliberate warmth that made me lean into him without thinking. "You've changed the course of this expedition entirely," he murmured, his voice carrying the weight of something unspoken. My chest tightened, the rhythm of his words echoing the rhythm of my own heartbeat. I dared a small smile. "We're only getting started," I said, letting my fingers brush his as I shifted slightly, testing the space between us. He didn't pull away. Instead, his hand lingered, a subtle tether, a promise of protection, of something steady I had never known in the hands of Silas or Anya. As the morning sun climbed higher, I felt a rare, steady warmth, the sense of being truly seen, of being understood, of being anchored. Magnus glanced at me, a flicker of softness in his eyes, and stepped closer. The distance between us disappeared in a heartbeat. He lowered his head, brushing his lips against mine in a kiss that was deliberate, gentle, and electric in its subtlety. My hands rose instinctively, resting against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of a heart I could trust. The kiss deepened, slow, careful, affirming, a promise of safety and intimacy without words. When we finally parted, the harbor stretched out before us, infinite and calm. Magnus rested his forehead against mine, letting the silence speak, letting the shared warmth linger, like the last note of a symphony. "We'll navigate this," he said, soft but certain, and I believed him. And for the first time, I realized that the tide had turned, not just in the battle against Silas and Anya, but in my heart. Magnus wasn't just my anchor. He was the harbor I had been searching for, steady, safe, and the morning fog clung stubbornly to the harbor, curling around the masts like soft, restless ghosts. I moved along the deck beside Magnus, feeling the comforting rhythm of his presence beside me. Each step we took together was a silent acknowledgement of the bond forming between us, a bond forged not only by shared purpose, but by the quiet understanding of who we were and who we could become. We spent the early hours inspecting the site of Silas's intended salvage, walking along the warped planks and inspecting the secured crates. My mind kept flashing back to the moment Anya had confessed, the sting of her tears still fresh. Magnus, however, remained an unshakable constant, guiding me not only through the technical details, but through the emotional aftermath of betrayal. At one point, as I leaned over to adjust a rope, his hand brushed against mine. It was accidental, brief, but enough to send a shiver through me. I looked up, and he was watching me with that calm, steady gaze that seemed to understand everything I hadn't yet admitted, even the flutter of my heart at such a small, deliberate touch. "You're relentless," he said softly, his voice low, almost teasing. "I can see why Silas found you frustrating." I smiled, feeling heat rise to my cheeks. "Frustrating can be good," I replied, letting my fingers linger a fraction longer near his. The air between us seemed to hum with unspoken words, subtle tension building like a coiled spring ready to snap. Magnus moved closer under the pretense of inspecting a nearby pulley, but I felt the warmth of him radiating, his shoulder brushing mine, his presence a tether against the chaos of my past. My pulse quickened, the world narrowing to the small space we shared, the small sparks of connection that were no longer accidental. We paused at the edge of the dock, the tide lapping gently against the pilings. Magnus rested a hand lightly on the railing, close enough that our fingers brushed when I joined him. "You know," he murmured, "there's a certain courage in what you're doing. Facing Silas and Anya, most would run. But you stand firm." I turned to him, searching his face, noting the faint curve of a smile, the warmth in his eyes. "I don't feel so courageous when I'm alone," I admitted, letting a small laugh escape me. "I feel exposed." "You're never alone," he said, his voice carrying a quiet intensity that made the words impossible to ignore. His hand shifted, fingers brushing mine. Not in passing this time, but deliberate, intentional. My breath caught, and for a moment, I allowed myself to savor it, to let myself feel the safety, the thrill, the intimacy in the shared silence. The sun broke through the fog in streaks of gold, illuminating his profile. He turned slightly, eyes locking with mine, and leaned just close enough that I could feel the heat of his body. "I've got your back, Corina," he whispered, the words a promise and a touchstone. I swallowed hard, heart hammering. I know." I breathed, letting my hand find his, fingers intertwining naturally. The tension between us, so carefully restrained, grew electric, the closeness of our bodies igniting a spark that neither of us tried to deny. Magnus tilted his head, his lips brushing against my temple in the gentlest, most protective gesture, and I closed my eyes, letting the warmth flood through me. It was a kiss of reassurance, of closeness, not yet consuming but enough to make my pulse race and my mind spin. When he pulled back slightly, just enough to look me in the eyes, I felt the depth of connection that had grown in a single morning, the trust, the attraction, the quiet intensity of a partnership that was becoming something far greater than shared purpose. "The tides are changing," he murmured, voice low, almost intimate. "And we're going to weather them together." I nodded, letting my hand linger in his, the touch lingering like a promise. The harbor stretched before us, calm yet alive, and I realized that Magnus was more than an ally. He was the anchor I had been searching for, steady and true, a harbor against the storms of Silas and Anya's betrayal, and perhaps something far more tender. Night had settled over the docks, painting the horizon in shades of indigo and silver. The air smelled of salt and wood, a familiar comfort that somehow made Magnus' presence feel even more grounding. We were walking along the pier after a long day of inspecting Silas's vessels, our boots echoing softly on the planks. I found myself stealing glances at him, noticing the way his shoulders moved with quiet strength, the easy confidence in his steps, the faint crease near his eyes when he smiled. Every small detail seemed magnified tonight, every brush of his hand against mine sending a ripple of warmth through me. "You missed a spot on the starboard hull," he said, breaking my reverie. His tone was teasing, and I caught the corner of his smile. I shook my head, laughing softly, trying to hide the quickening of my pulse. "I suppose you'll have to show me again," I said, letting my voice carry just a hint of flirtation. He leaned closer, our shoulders brushing as he pointed toward the hull. "I could, but I'm afraid you'd use that as an excuse to stay in my company longer," he said, his gaze lingering on mine a moment longer than necessary. I felt a shiver run through me, a delicious mix of anticipation and comfort. "Maybe I would," I whispered, and for a moment, the world contracted to just the two of us, the quiet harbor and the subtle electricity humming between us. As we walked further down the pier, he reached for a rope, and our hands met again, fingers tingling naturally. This time, there was no hesitation. I felt the strength in his grasp, the steady warmth that seemed to anchor me. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let myself enjoy the subtle intimacy, the kind that didn't need words. Magnus chuckled softly, as if reading my thoughts. "You know," he said, voice low and intimate, "there's something about being this close to someone you trust. It's rare." I met his gaze, feeling a strange mixture of courage and vulnerability. "I know," I replied, "especially after what I've been through." My hand brushed against his again, and he didn't flinch or pull away. He merely tightened his grip, a silent reassurance. We paused near the end of the pier, the water reflecting the moonlight in 1,000 tiny sparks. He leaned against the railing, and I found myself close to him, our shoulders almost touching. The air between us was charged, quiet but heavy with unspoken promises. "You're fearless," he murmured, eyes fixed on the horizon, but somehow always aware of me. "But even the brave need a harbor sometimes." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "And I think I've found mine," I said softly, letting my head tilt just enough to brush against his shoulder. Magnus turned slightly, and I felt the warmth of him envelop me, a protective cocoon that made my chest tighten with something I hadn't expected, longing. His hand moved to rest lightly on my back, thumb brushing my spine in a deliberate, comforting rhythm. I leaned in closer, the scent of him filling my senses, the solid weight of him against me grounding and thrilling all at once. Then, just as the tension reached its quiet crescendo, he leaned down, lips grazing mine in a tentative, exploratory kiss. It was soft, careful, but laden with promise. My hands instinctively found his, fingers curling around his as I deepened the kiss, letting myself trust him completely for the first time in what felt like forever. When we finally pulled back, our foreheads resting together, Magnus' eyes held mine with unwavering warmth. "We'll face everything," he said softly. "Together." I nodded, heart pounding, feeling the first true relief of safety and connection since Silas's betrayal. The harbor, the night, the gentle lapping of water, all of it felt alive with possibility. And in Magnus, I found more than a partner in purpose. I found someone I could feel, trust, and perhaps even love. The early morning fog hugged the docks like a soft blanket, dampening sounds and lending the harbor an almost sacred quiet. Magnus and I were the first to arrive, our boots echoing softly against the wet planks. I felt a flutter of anticipation at the thought of being near him again. The night's kiss lingered in my mind, a warmth that followed me even in the cool, salty air. As we moved along the pier, inspecting lines and sails, our hands brushed repeatedly. Each touch was electric, deliberate, and yet somehow casual. Magnus didn't flinch. He met my glances with the faintest smirk, the kind that made my pulse spike. It was subtle, playful, but I could feel the intention behind it. "You're awfully quiet this morning," he said, his voice low, teasing. "Plotting revenge against Silas already?" I laughed softly, feeling the tension of the past weeks ease just a little. "I'm thinking about strategy, yes," I replied, letting my shoulder brush his as we passed a stack of ropes. "And perhaps about how unfair it is that you're always calm while I'm the one running on adrenaline." He chuckled, a deep, rich sound that made my chest tighten. "I have my secrets," he said, tilting his head, his eyes glinting with mischief. "But I'm starting to think your adrenaline is contagious." We paused at the edge of the dock, where the water lapped gently against the hulls of moored vessels. I looked out at the shimmering reflection, then back at Magnus, feeling a sudden boldness. "I don't know how I ever managed before you," I admitted, my voice soft, almost a whisper. His gaze held mine, steady and unwavering. "You never had to," he said. "I've always been here, even when you didn't realize it." The warmth in his words sent a shiver down my spine. I took a step closer, letting my hand brush against his arm. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned subtly into my touch, fingers brushing mine in the gentlest, most intimate way. My heart thrummed, a rapid cadence matching the rhythm of the water around us. "Magnus," I murmured, letting my voice carry more than words, letting it carry desire, trust, and longing. He smiled softly, his hand moving to rest lightly on my back, his thumb drawing small circles that made my skin tingle. "Corina," he whispered, voice low and intimate, "I don't just want to be here for the battles. I want to be here for everything." My pulse jumped, and without thinking, I closed the tiny distance between us. Our foreheads touched first, a gentle, grounding contact, and then our lips met in a kiss that was both tentative and full of promise. It started soft, exploratory, and soon deepened naturally as we let the trust and longing of the past week spill into this single, heated moment. When we finally pulled back, breathless, the space between us still vibrated with unspoken words. I rested my head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath my ear, a rhythm that felt like home. "I didn't realize," I started, voice trembling slightly, "how much I needed someone who actually had my back. Not just professionally, but in every way." Magnus' lips brushed the top of my head in a tender, protective gesture. "And I didn't realize how much I'd been waiting to show you," he murmured. "I'm not going anywhere, Corina. I promise you that." We lingered in silence, letting the harbor absorb our shared warmth, the morning fog curling around us like a private world. Every glance, every touch, every shared breath deepened the bond between us. The fear of Silas and Anya faded, replaced by something solid, enduring, and infinitely more satisfying, the knowledge that we had each other. As the first light of dawn hit the water, Magnus wrapped his arm around my shoulders, drawing me even closer. My cheek pressed against his chest, and I allowed myself to melt into him, feeling safer than I had in years. His fingers traced light, deliberate patterns along my arm, teasing, intimate but never rushed. In that quiet, foggy morning, I realized that no matter what Silas or Anya tried next, I had found more than a partner in Magnus. I had found my anchor, my confidant, and perhaps my first true love. The morning sun was weak, spilling pale gold over the harbor, but inside me, a storm was brewing, not of fear, but of excitement. Magnus and I moved through the shipyard, checking ropes and sails, though my attention kept drifting to him. There was something in the way he handled the lines, the careful precision of his hands, the quiet confidence in every movement. I watched, mesmerized, feeling the familiar stir of anticipation in my chest. He caught me staring. His lips quirked into a knowing smile, and I felt a heat rise to my cheeks. "Am I supposed to be flattered or concerned?" he asked, his voice low and teasing, close enough that I could feel the warmth of it against my ear. Both, I admitted, trying to sound casual while my heart thumped in a rapid, unpredictable rhythm. He laughed softly, a deep, soothing sound, and reached for a coil of rope. As he handed it to me, our fingers brushed deliberately, the contact lingering just long enough to send a thrill through me. I couldn't stop the tiny shiver that ran along my spine. Magnus' eyes held mine, steady and unflinching, full of unspoken promises and quiet mischief. The day moved slowly, every task punctuated by fleeting touches, accidental elbows brushing, shoulders nudging, and hands briefly lingering on mine. Each contact built tension, a subtle dance of proximity and awareness. I noticed the way he angled his body toward me, how his gaze softened when I looked up from the ropes, and how every small smile seemed to reach deep into the corners of my thoughts. We paused near the edge of the dock to inspect the hull of a vessel. Magnus leaned close, just enough for me to feel the warmth of his body. "You've got a tendency to overthink," he said quietly, almost teasingly. "But somehow, it works in your favor." I laughed softly, brushing a stray strand of hair behind my ear. "I suppose I could say the same about you," I replied, letting my fingers graze the back of his hand as I reached for the railing. His palm was rough yet comforting, a grounding presence against the rising tension of the morning. Minutes stretched into hours, each one filled with the unspoken magnetic pull between us. At one point, we paused under the shade of an old mast, both of us catching our breath from hauling lines. I dared to glance up at him, heart hammering, and found him studying me with a quiet intensity that made my chest tighten. "Magnus," I whispered, letting the single word hang in the salty air. He leaned closer, just enough that I could feel his warmth without his lips touching mine. The anticipation, the electric charge between us, made my pulse race. Then, in one fluid motion, he closed the small distance between us. His hand cupped my cheek, thumb brushing lightly along my jawline, and his lips met mine in a slow, deliberate kiss. It was soft at first, exploratory, then deepened naturally, carrying all the trust, longing, and unspoken words we had been building. I pressed closer, wrapping my arms around him, feeling the solid reassurance of his body against mine. When we finally pulled back, breathless and laughing softly at the shared intensity, Magnus rested his forehead against mine. "We should probably get back to work," he murmured, though his eyes danced with mischief and warmth. "I think we can manage a few more minutes of motivation," I replied, letting a playful smile curl on my lips. His laugh was low, vibrating against my chest as he pulled me close again, fingers tracing light, deliberate patterns along my back. Even as the day's work continued, the world around us seemed smaller, softer, and somehow infinitely more intimate. I realized, with a mix of awe and relief, that the chaos of Silas and Anya's schemes could rage outside our small, protected bubble, but Magnus and I had found a safe harbor within each other. And in that moment, with the sun glinting off the water and Magnus' hands warm against my skin, I finally understood something essential. No matter how treacherous the tides, no matter how cunning the storms, some bonds were built to endure. The morning mist rolled over the harbor like a soft, protective veil. I stood on the deck, the salt air filling my lungs, and felt a quiet sense of anticipation settle over me. Magnus was already at the bow, checking the rigging with meticulous care, but today his focus kept drifting toward me. I could see it in the way his gaze lingered, the gentle curve of his mouth, the subtle curl of his fingers as they brushed over ropes. For years, Silas and Anya had plotted, weaving their greed and ambition into a tangled web meant to trap me. But today, I knew the tide had turned. Every document I had prepared, every detail I had shared with Magnus, had come together in perfect precision. Regulatory boards were reviewing every salvage license, every ballast log, every survey. The schemes that had once felt unstoppable were crumbling like a shipwreck battered by relentless waves. Magnus walked toward me, the creak of the deck beneath his boots matching the steady beat of my heart. "It's done," he said quietly, a hint of triumph in his voice. "They won't get a single permit approved, not without a full audit, and the boards are taking it seriously." A surge of relief swept through me. I felt weightless, as if years of tension, betrayal, and fear were finally dissolving into the morning air. I closed my eyes, letting the warmth of his hand settle over mine, the rough calluses grounding me in the present. "You were incredible," Magnus murmured, his thumb brushing over the back of my hand. "I could never have done this without you." "I couldn't have done it without you," I admitted, letting my voice tremble slightly. The intimacy between us had grown quietly, deliberately, through shared work and trust, but now it felt unstoppable, like a current pulling us together. He stepped closer, reducing the space between us to nothing, and I felt the heat of his body, steady and protective. My hand lifted on its own, resting against his chest, feeling the solid beat of his heart beneath his shirt. Magnus' other hand reached up, cupping my face gently, his fingers brushing a loose strand of hair behind my ear. The world seemed to contract until there was nothing but us. The rocking of the yacht, the distant call of gulls, the soft slap of water against the hull. And then, with deliberate care, he pressed his lips to mine. It was slow at first, exploratory, but deepened quickly, carrying all the weight of trust, gratitude, and longing we had built together over the years. My arms wrapped around him, pressing close, feeling the undeniable strength of his body as it sheltered me from every past betrayal. When we finally parted, breaths mingling in the crisp sea air, Magnus rested his forehead against mine. "We've earned this," he whispered. "This, us." I smiled against him, feeling a thrill of warmth and certainty I had never known with Silas or Anya.
"Yes,
"We have," I agreed, the words tasting like freedom and new beginnings. Later, as the harbor glinted in the rising sun, I watched Silas's fleet return empty-handed, their plans thwarted by the regulatory boards Magnus had helped guide. Anya stood silently at the edge, her ambition undone, while I felt no anger, only the calm satisfaction of justice served. The betrayal that had once threatened to drown me had been rendered powerless. Magnus slipped his hand into mine, fingers intertwining naturally, and I realized that I didn't just trust him. I relied on him, not as a crutch, but as a partner, a steady harbor against any storm. We walked together along the dock, shoulders brushing, hearts in sync, the morning air fragrant with salt and promise. Finally, he paused, turning me to face him fully. His hands rested lightly on my waist, drawing me close. "No matter what comes," he said softly, "we face it together." I pressed my hands to his chest, feeling the solid reassurance of him beneath my fingers. "Together," I echoed, my voice sure, unwavering. And then, under the rising sun, with the ocean stretching endlessly before us, Magnus kissed me again. Long, slow, and certain. It was a kiss that sealed years of loss, of betrayal, of struggle, and transformed it into something lasting, profound, and true. I melted into it, finally feeling anchored, safe, and wholly loved. Years later, Magnus and I ran an ethical maritime salvage operation together. Our days were filled with purpose, integrity, and laughter. The sea was our home, but he was my harbor, my anchor, my safe harbor. And for the first time in my life, I belonged entirely to someone who would never betray me.